You know, as much as I love diving deep into new Lightroom editing features or techniques, sometimes it's just fun to go through an editing session from start to finish. And usually the idea for these types of videos pop up in my head as I'm editing a photo, and I realize that it'd be a lot of fun to share that particular workflow with you. Now, the reason why I chose this image in particular is because it lets me explain some important decisions that I made while I was at the location with my camera. And it also lets me tell you about how those decisions affect my post-processing. My hope is that with this workflow video, it'll challenge you to really think about your approach to each composition, and it'll remind you to ask yourself, is there a better way to approach this shot? Because I admit that I often forget to ask that, and so this is also a great reminder for me as well. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so as you can see, this is the photo that I want to edit. And let me start by explaining the composition side of things. So let's open, this is a single photo. And if I look at the metadata, it was taken with the Sony a7R Mark III and the Sony 12 to 24 millimeter lens at 12 millimeters. So this was already at its absolute widest. Now, the 12 to 24 millimeter, it has this kind of bulbous front element, so you can't really easily apply any sort of polarizer or neutral density filter. You have to get these gigantic adapters with these even larger filters, and I actually had that. It was this giant adapter that kind of sticks to the front of the lens, and then I slide in a massive ND filter, and so that's how I was able to get the kind of exposure to get this effect here with the waterfall. Now, because this waterfall was falling pretty fast and pretty hard, and it was windy, and the neutral density filter was gigantic, you can see all of the water droplets on the front. But that's not really the point of this. The point of this is I want you to look at the composition. So when I was standing here, I mean, there was a lot more interesting stuff kind of to the left and to the right. But even at 12 millimeters, which remember, that's a massively wide focal length. And usually you can get a bunch of stuff in there, but even with that here, you can see that I like the composition, it's fine. But when I was standing here, I thought to myself, or rather I asked myself, is there a better approach that I can take to get more of this field in my composition? And so that's where the idea came in to do a pano. So you can see here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 images where I took my camera and I shifted it vertically, and let's walk through them. Now you can see if I select one of the images, you can see same thing, A7R Mark III, 12 to 24 at 12 millimeters. So it's still a very wide composition. Let's go here. And if I go from, I guess, left to right, or this will be right to left, you can see how, one, I'm getting a lot more information up on top, but also I'm able to get more information to the left of the waterfall. Because again, let's go ahead here. You can see how I don't really have a lot of information up here. So obviously what this means is we need to stitch these into a pano. And I have a video that I'll link to at the end of this one where I go over kind of some important things to pay attention to when you are stitching a pano. But the first thing I'll do, generally speaking, I don't do too much here. I'll go to the edit mode, and I'm going to go and select the white balance dropper. Let's select something that's kind of neutral gray like this. And you can see how we were able to get some of that color cast away from the ND filter I was using. Also, sometimes if you go down here, you will see that there is an option to apply lens correction. So let's see what happens with a 12 millimeter. Does a pretty good job, so I'm going to enable it. You can see how it got rid of some of that barrel distortion and lens vignetting, so we'll keep that on. And then the other thing I'll do is at the very top, I'm going to change my profile to Adobe Landscape because I prefer that profile just as kind of like the baseline. When I'm editing landscape photos, it can work on any photos. It doesn't have to be a landscape photo. It's just that this particular Adobe profile, I like what it does in terms of color and tone as a starting point. You can use profiles far more creatively, almost like a preset. But I generally approach profiles as just kind of like getting me to a good baseline on which to build my edits. So now that I have those three adjustments done, I'll go back to the grid view here. And what I need to do is sync those changes from this original image to the remaining pano brackets. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and click on the bottom here. There's this little gear icon. Now I prefer to just copy the changes that I made to the clipboard. So what I'm going to do is go to select and then select none. And then I'm going to enable the checkboxes for the things that I changed. So I applied a creative profile using Adobe Landscape. Then under color, I applied a custom white balance. And then finally, under the optics here, let's enable that, but we're going to disable chromatic aberration because I didn't use that. I only did enable lens corrections. So now I'm going to click on copy, and that'll copy those settings. I'll select the remaining images. And then now on the bottom here, you'll see it says paste edit settings. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And so now all of these images have the same custom white balance, the same Adobe landscape profile, and the lens correction applied. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to merge these. So I'll select them, right click, go to photo merge, and then select panorama merge. And so right off the bat, you can see that I do have it's a wider composition, but the video that I just referenced that I'm going to link to at the end of this one, again, there are some important things to pay attention to when you are stitching a panoramic photo together. And the first one, and probably most importantly, is the projection. So you can see we have 3 projections here. I like kind of what it did here, but because this was such an ultra wide composition, you can almost see how everything is becoming more stout, like the trees are being pushed down and the waterfall looks kind of short. So let's go ahead and try cylindrical here. And actually, I do like cylindrical. I like what it did here. It obviously changed the aspect ratio significantly. Here, this is more of a horizontal aspect ratio, almost kind of like a 4:3. But this one here, this is almost kind of like you're going to be posting a vertical image to Instagram, kind of like a 4:5. But that's fine because you can see the trees look more normal in terms of perspective. The waterfall looks more normal. And so now what we need to do is figure out how we want to address the areas of the composition that couldn't be stitched together. Now, I go over this in more detail in that pano video, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. What I'll do is I'm going to use the boundary warp a little bit. Actually, before I do that, let me show you sometimes, not always, but sometimes you'll select a projection and it won't work. So perspective here, I know won't work. You can see we get an error. It just, for whatever reason, the way that this projection algorithm works, the images can't resolve. So I'm going to go back to cylindrical. That's just kind of what we're working with here. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply this boundary warp until this fallen tree trunk here looks kind of straight. So I'll go to right around there. So there, the tree trunk looks pretty straight here. Now there are 3 ways that I can address the missing areas here. I can either click on fill edges, where Lightroom will use content aware fill to kind of fill these in. And sometimes it does a pretty good job. In this case here, actually, I like it. I like what it did. The other thing that you can do is if you turn this off is you can just crop in. You can either select auto crop, in which case Lightroom will do the cropping for you, or you can click on merge and then use the crop tool to crop manually. But again, I like what Lightroom did here. It actually works pretty well. So I'm going to stick with this. Now what I'm going to do is click on merge to create that pano stitch as a DNG file. All right, so here you can see we have the pano image. There's a little badge on the top right of the thumbnail that says pano. And what we can do is, actually what I'm going to do really quickly here is just to get things a little bit more kind of comparative, I'm going to get that custom white balance. Now, let's just compare these 2 images. I'll close out the edit panel here, and so we can see the difference in composition. So again, this is totally subjective. Ignore, obviously, all the raindrops and stuff. But in terms of the composition here, like, this is not bad. I mean, I like the way the waterfall's coming down and then the stream's coming here. In fact, one of the things I would consider doing is flipping this horizontally just so that we go from left to right. But here, this to me looks better. There's a lot more interest here. First of all, you've got this really nice kind of dip here in the rock. You see more of the sky, you see more of the trees. And then you also have more interesting movement in the foreground. And this is why I decided to go for a pano, because even at 12 millimeters, this is fine. This is a fine composition. But I asked myself, is there something better that I can do? And so, yes, while the aspect ratio is different, this is clearly a horizontal image. This one is more of like a 4:5, like I said. I still like this better. And I can always crop this to kind of simulate a horizontal aspect ratio. So I have plenty of information here. So I just kind of wanted to compare the two for you. All right, now let's go ahead to the image here and let's just make a few quick edits. First thing, let's go to crop here and let's rotate this because it feels a little bit off balance. There, that's looking better. Actually, speaking of crop, I will go crop here and I'm going to crop in just a little bit from the top left, right around there. And you know what? No, I'm going to come in here too. I want to get rid of this area there. Just crop in like that. All right, now that's looking good. Now, if I'm looking at the histogram here, I can see that we've got a lot of blown out highlights. And I could go ahead and reduce the highlights here because most of it is from the sky. The problem is that it's reducing the highlights throughout the image, which I don't want. Most of that blown out information is up here. So what I'm going to do before I do anything else is I'm going to go to the masking tools here. I'm going to use the adaptive mask selection here. And I'm not going to bother making my secret sky selection here. I just want to get this here and adjust the highlights and the white point just in the sky. So right around there. It's okay to have some blown out highlights in the sky. No worries there. But the point is that I was able to adjust the highlights of the sky without affecting the rest of the image. And that's why masking is so powerful. Now let's go ahead. I'm going to rename this here just so that I know that this is called Sky Mask. I always rename my masks just to make it easier to identify later. I'm not going to do too much more other than maybe in the sky, I might warm that up, the temperature, just because you can see it's got this beautiful sun glow there. All right, now let's go back here and I'm going to go ahead and open up the overall white point and drop the black point a little bit. I'm not going to touch highlights or shadows yet because what I want to do is apply my favorite S-curve for some contrast. So I'm going to brighten that up here. Let's add a little bit more depth to the shadows. Then let's open up midtones a little bit, somewhere right around there. And then of course, just to soften those dark shadows, I'm going to add a little bit of a gray. Now, when you add a tone curve, it adjusts the saturation, color saturation. So I generally like to bring this down. Usually between 50 and 60% is where I fall. Then let's go ahead to the color calibration panel. If you don't see this in Lightroom, that's because it's hidden by default. To view it, you'll click on the ellipsis over here, and then you'll see there's this option called Show Color Calibration. And really, the one slider I almost always go to under blue primary is saturation. And so I'm going to increase this. And if I go back and forth, especially kind of in the greens, you can see how it just makes the greens pop, which is really nice. So that's good right there. Now, there are two local edits that I want to make in the foreground. The first is I want to bring out kind of the greens over here, like I just mentioned, not as much up here, just kind of the greens in the foreground because they look a little dark. And then I also want to make the moving water a little bit brighter. And so I'm going to create two separate masks for that. So we'll go back to our masking tools here. Let's create a new mask. I'm going to select linear gradient, and I'm just going to draw up from here. And so you can see if I hover over, this is where the mask is being applied, where this kind of yellow color is. But I want to refine it where I only have the greens within this selection. So to do that, we're going to use intersect. Intersect is probably the most powerful tool within masking. I'm going to click on the ellipsis on the mask here. I'm going to go to intersect with mask using, and then I'm going to select color range, and then I'm going to click on a color here. Now, let's turn the overlay on. You can see here how this, you remember the selection was just this kind of yellow, but now we're only selecting the greens, and there's this refine slider here, which I can further refine the color. So if I bring it to the left, I'm going to remove most of that green, which is what I want. I really only want, see here, just those greens there, right there. You don't want it to be kind of like this. You don't want it to be super sharp. You actually want to have a little bit of a fall off because otherwise it makes the edits that you apply, it makes it look kind of fake because you see you'll get these weird artifacts and halos and these abrupt edges. So it's good to find the area on the refine slider that it looks where it looks good and then bring it back a little bit, which is what I did here. You can see that really right around here is what I want selected, but I'm actually going to bring it back to include a little bit more. All right, so now that we have the selection dialed in, what I can do is open up the exposure a little bit, bump the highlights, and then of course, increase saturation. And so it just gives you this really nice glow. Now, if the overall strength of this mask is too strong, remember that you have this amount slider. This slider gets overlooked all the time, and it controls the overall strength of that mask. And so you can bring this down, or you could double it if you want, but I'll usually kind of bring it down just a little bit there. And then let's go ahead and rename this. We'll call this Green Moss Boost. So I know that that's for that area there. And then again, what I want to do is I want to boost the moving water. I want to make it a little bit brighter. So we're going to do something similar. We're going to create a new mask here. We'll select another linear gradient. Let's just make our selection here. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Let's go to intersect with a color range. And I'm just going to select this gray. Let's turn the overlay on. And now you can see that we have just the kind of gray and brighter areas. Like before, I could have used a luminance range, but I just wanted to use the color range. It works well in this particular case. And so I'm going to get the refine slider to right around here. Let's turn the overlay off. Now, just like before, let's open up the exposure a little bit. And let's open up the highlights and even the white point. So you can see how it pops more. It looks a little bit brighter. And you can see we can toggle all of the masks so you can see the effects that each of these masks have. It's really cool. Let's go ahead and rename this here. We'll call this Moving Water Mask. Just so that I'm not very creative with my mask titles, but I do like to rename them so I know what's what. In fact, what I want to do is click on the mask, and then I'm going to drop that amount slider just a little bit too. And the last selective edit I want to make is I want to add a nice glow to the top here. You can see how there's directional light from the sun, and I want to accentuate that. So to do that, I'm going to zoom out to like 12%, create another mask, and I'm going to select radial gradient, and I'm just going to make a giant, big selection. And I'll hover over to see where the spill is on the image. So right around there, that looks good. Let's go back to fit. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a negative dehaze because that will give me this really nice glow. You see this glow there? I mean, it just adds a nice diffuse quality, but I want it to be warmer. I want it to match kind of the warm sunlight. So I'm going to go to the temperature slider here and warm that up and even add a little bit of saturation to that. And then what I can also do is zoom back out to 12% and just kind of position that glow. You see how it's cool the way I could get that glow. Like if I want more on this side, I can do that. So right maybe around there that looks good. Let's go ahead and let's rename this. We'll call this Sun Glow, and we will adjust the amount. So right around there. Then we can go ahead and finish things up by going to sharpening here. So I'm going to zoom in on an area that should have some good detail like this. Let's press and hold on the Option key or Alt key on Windows and adjust the amount slider until we start to see good detail. You don't want to go too far because that's going to over sharpen things. So somewhere right around there. And then with masking, Option or Alt click and drag. And we're going to remove sharpening from areas that don't need it. Basically areas that don't have texture to it. And finally, let's apply a nice post-crop vignette. It's okay here. Normally I'll use a radial filter for a custom vignette, but this works out well. Add a nice feather and let's recover some of those highlights. So there you have it. If we press on the backslash key, you could see that is the unedited photo, but it was obviously a stitched pano. And then here, I mean, this was great. It was a nice little edit. I love the fact that we were able to get more of the composition in place because I used a pano. Again, you ask yourself, is this the best approach to the particular composition? Now, of course, I could have spent time removing some of these spots here, but I didn't want to waste the time there. Just know that that's something that I would also do. But that is pretty much the workflow that I would approach for this image. And so I hope this video kind of, again, inspires you and reminds you to ask yourself, is this the best approach that you can take for this composition? Remember, it could be just saying like, oh, maybe a vertical shot would be better instead of horizontal, or maybe I should stitch some images to get a better overall composition. Just be mindful of that when you're out there with your camera. And that way you know you'll get the best possible shot given the circumstances. Now, I've mentioned a few different techniques in this video here. If you want to learn more, if you want to improve your landscape editing, then please check out my course called Lightroom Landscapes. It is all about how to use Lightroom to its fullest to get really great results with your landscape photos. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. I also mentioned that there is a video on how to get the most out of Lightroom's pano stitching feature, so check that out. Of course, if this video was helpful, a thumbs up is always appreciated, and be sure to click on the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified of all future videos. Thanks a lot, everyone.